This episode of New Politics was released on the 8th of June, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the new political career of Josh Frydenberg fails even before it begins. How much should we pay for a politician's speechwriter? And there's new nature-positive legislation being introduced by the government, but will it do anything or is it just spin and marketing? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, campaign manager for Josh Frydenberg for Kooyong.
And we've got another shameless plug about our new book, Fixing Australian Politics, How to Change Our System of Government. It's now available for $22.95 for the book or $9.99 for the Kindle version on Amazon. It is available as a free PDF to our Patreon and Substack subscribers. And of course, if you do want to support New Politics and independent journalism, you can support us through Patreon or Substack or go to our website at newpolitics.com.au. There was a big flurry of activity last weekend and much salivation in the media about the prospects of the former Liberal Party Treasurer Josh Frydenberg returning to federal politics. And there was so much joy and happiness in the Conservative media that it was almost like they had announced that Robert Menzies was making a political comeback. And while Menzies and Frydenberg both held the seat of Kooyong during their political careers, that's pretty much where the similarities end. Menzies was a major political figure, not just in the Liberal Party, but in Australian political history. Frydenberg is a little bit more like a little footnote in history, who also had the chance to lead the Liberal Party, but chose not to. And then he lost the seat of Kooyong to the independent candidate, Monique Ryan, at the 2022 federal election. Now, at that time, he did say that he was going to spend some more time with his family and the political game was pretty much over for him. Well, who knows, maybe he didn't like spending that much time with his family, but it did seem like it was a kite-flying exercise to find out what the reaction would be if he did make a return to politics. And Sky News have pretty much been pleading with him for several months to make a return to politics. And here's one of those examples in this exchange between Sherry Markson of Sky News and Josh Frydenberg.
Josh, from the moment I mentioned to my viewers that you were coming on my program tonight, there's only one thing everybody wants to know. When are you returning to federal politics?
I'm not rushing back. I'm really enjoying family life, coaching the local footy team and enjoying my work in the private sector. But I'm not saying never ever.
So the next election's in about a year's time. It should be early 2025. So you're thinking the election after that could be 2028?
That's a lifetime away, Shari. I'm sure we'll speak more between now and then.
And even when Josh Frydenberg announced that no, he wasn't going to make a return to politics, Sky News just kept on forcing the issue.
Let's turn to former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. There's been a lot of speculation about whether he would run again for his old seat of Kooyong at the next election. But today, Josh Frydenberg poured cold water on this. He posted on X or Twitter that I'm not rushing back to politics. My position on contesting the next election remains unchanged. I will continue to support the Liberal Party and our local candidate, Amelia Hammer. Now, Josh has made the decision here that he wants to continue to spend time with his family.
Yes.
He's enjoying spending a lot of time with his kids, being a footy coach.
Yep.
But what really bothered me is that, you know, the second there might have been a suggestion that he was going to come back, there was this outpouring of anger from women's groups that how dare the former treasurer, the most accomplished politician in the country, want to come back to politics in a winnable seat? Oh, because it might mean that a woman doesn't have her job. Come on. If Peter Dutton stepped down for whatever reason, there would be no obvious successor. There is no second alternative leader. Unfortunately, Josh is not coming back. The country needs more strong, talented politicians. The country needs Josh Frydenberg.
Fortunately, Sky News doesn't represent the electorate. Nobody else wanted Josh Frydenberg to return to politics except for the mainstream media, and it seems that all the pampering that he did get from News Corporation just went straight to his head.
It's a funny thing with conservative media in that they get an idea that figure X is the saviour of the party and pump figure X and pump figure X and then get really disappointed when figure X isn't interested. And I remember Peter Costello asked a million times if he wanted to become leader of the Liberal Party. And he said, no, I'm not interested. And no one believed him. As it happened, when he had the opportunity to challenge, he didn't. Some people put that to a lack of courage. That's possible, but I actually think he really didn't want the job, having become treasurer, knowing that the Liberal Party was on the way out electorally anyway, and knowing that he couldn't save the party, decided to try and pass it on to the next generation. I'm no fan of Costello, in case people are saying, well, it sounds like you're defending him. I'm not real. I'm just pointing out what I see as what happened. With Frydenberg, I think it's a bit the same. He didn't lose the Kooyong election in a shock. He had dwindled the numbers away due to his own performance in the seat. So he wasn't quite the same as the underperforming Peter Costello, in that I think Costello wasn't loathed by as many people as Frydenberg was. I'm not saying Costello was a shining figure of popularity, by the way, but I don't think he had the same level of disdain held for him. And Kooyong, of course, is probably the crown in the jewel of the Liberal Party. I've said this before. It's only had 6 members since Federation and 3 leaders of the opposition, 2 foreign affairs ministers, a High Court judge, a Prime Minister, 2 Attorneys General.
Well, it's not the jewel in the crown anymore.
No, it's not. And it won't be back. Monique Ryan, despite the complaints of the surviving Liberals in the seat, and I saw part of the seat described as Trot Central. Honestly, some of these people need to read a book or 2. It would be the equivalent of calling Graindler neoliberal central or something like that. It's just not even close to an accurate. Why bother? And
that's exactly the point. But we can see that Josh Frydenberg is missing the limelight and being the centre of attention, and that's pretty much understandable. Politics is incredibly addictive once you're in the game, but I think that overall he's had a pretty good run. He was in politics for 12 years. He did become the Treasurer of Australia, and in Australian politics, that's pretty much the second best position that you can have in politics. And just like Peter Costello before him, never actually got to the number 1 position, but politics doesn't always work out the way that you want it to work out. But the fact is that he wasn't such a good treasurer anyway, and I think that he is quite overrated as a potential leader of the Liberal Party. Now, the economy overall, it was heading towards a recession in early 2020, just before COVID arrived, and his performance as energy minister under Malcolm Turnbull, it wasn't that great either. And as far as I can see, he's always been involved in the game of politics or playing political games rather than actually doing anything useful. Here's that famous exchange between Josh Frydenberg when he was the energy minister and the former South Australian Premier, Jay Weatherill, in 2017 over renewable energy policy.
I spoke to the Prime Minister this morning. It shows that, we are focused on renewables, we're focused on storage, and we are doing it in different parts of the country at the same time. The Prime Minister and I worked very closely together yesterday with my other colleagues, Matt Canavan and Arthur Sinodinos, on this important agreement with the gas players.
Premier, do you find this a bit galling?
Yes, I mean, it shows that the Commonwealth Government are in a white-knuckled panic about national energy policy. I've got to say, it is a little galling to be standing here next to a man that's been standing up with his Prime Minister, bagging South Australia at every step of the way over the last 6 months, to be standing here on this occasion, him suggesting that we want to work together. It is a disgrace the way in which your government has treated our state. It is the most anti-South Australian government we have seen from a Commonwealth government in living memory. What we have is a national energy market that is broken. We had a Prime Minister that came in here to this state during the course of the last federal election campaign, celebrating our leadership in relation to renewable energy, and then taking credit for it through his own renewable energy target. And for you to then turn around within a few short months when there's a blackout and point the finger at South Australia for the fact that our leadership in renewable energy was the cause of that problem is an absolute disgrace. And you'd be standing here, sitting next to us, trying to take credit for some small scheme which goes nowhere near fixing the size and the extent of the problems that have been created in this state is an outrage.
So it looks like Josh Frydenberg's political comeback is over, even before it started, for the time being at least. But at least it lasted for a little bit longer than Mel Meninga's political career back in 2001, which lasted less than a minute.
At least Mel Meninga was honest. He got up and started doing all the things that politicians have to do and said, no, I can't handle this, and walked off. And there's an honesty there that you've got to acknowledge. Would he have been a good member? Who knows? His colleague, Glenn Lazarus, the brick with eyes, as a senator, was actually one of that crop of senators that included Ricky Muir, and they were actually grew into the role. And it was a shame to see them lose at the next election. They weren't absolutely brilliant, but they were actually trying to get their heads around what was best for Australia and what they thought was best for Australia, and trying to work within their ethics and beliefs and philosophies. And that's much better than a lot of senators today who are just there, I think, to suck up the salary and get as much expenses as they like. So Mel Meninga would probably be like that, but he didn't want to go through the rubbish of politics. Frydenberg, of course, loves the rubbish of politics, and he has ambition for the role, but once he gets the role, he doesn't seem to know what to do with it, much like the dog chasing the car. It's all very well, but what's he going to do if he catches it? And based on past performance, Josh Frydenberg being better than Peter Dutton is like hepatitis being better than cancer. Neither is strictly desirable, and you don't want either of them. So I think we can wish him well and hope that he continues in his career as chairman of the Australian Goldman Sachs, and that we never hear from him in a public capacity again would be good.
Yeah, but I guess overall this shows up a big problem within the Liberal Party, which you and I have identified for some time. And just for the one time, I do agree with Sherry Markson. If Peter Dutton does resign, well, who else is there? And of course, someone has to fill up the position, but the talent just isn't there. You know, not that Josh Frydenberg is that talented. And if that's the best that they've got for the Liberal Party, and he's not in Parliament anyway, it just goes to show that they've got a lot of problems, or at least leadership problems. And they've also got all of those issues in the Victoria branch of the Liberal Party, and there's quite a lot of political infighting. They've got quite a few branches that have been taken over by religious zealots from Mormons and Pentecostal groups. And I think generally the Liberal Party is taking note of what's going on down there, and they're carefully trying to piece itself together in Victoria. And I still think that it's a lost cause down there, but they have pre-selected Amelia Hamer in the seat of Kooyong against Monique Ryan, and I still think that Monique Ryan is likely to hold on to the seat of Kooyong. But even still, the Liberal Party does need to reform itself and make a break from the past. And it's probably making little moves along those lines. But I think that the return of Josh Frydenberg, whether it's this election or the next election, and whether it was going to be in the seat of Kooyong or anywhere else in Melbourne, I think that just would have upset that process.
I think the Liberal Party should be encouraged to try and solve the problems that they have. As I understand it, Amelia Hamer is a moderate. Of course, moderates tend to harden once they're in office, but a moderate woman is exactly who beat them in Kooyong, and to bring in another hardline male was going to be absolute suicide. So there's obviously people within the Liberal Party in Victoria who are starting to see maybe we should listen to what the electorate is after. I'm going to assume that Hamer is related to the Premier Hamer. And like Allegra Spender, who was granddaughter of Percy Spender and son and daughter of John. And there's a few around where the family go into politics, which makes sense when it's the life you're used to. You tend to follow in your parents' footsteps in some cases. So I don't think Monique Ryan is going anywhere, but at least they're taking it seriously and putting in someone who might be able to put them into a winnable position in an election or three, if she can keep her mouth shut on particular topics and listen to what the electorate wants and agree with the electorate in at least a broad sense. It might be the way that the Liberal Party works its way back to relevancy. And they've got probably the hardest job in Victoria. So we've got to acknowledge them and encourage more of this.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
It was revealed in Senate estimate hearings during the week that the speechwriter for the Minister for Government Services and NDIS, Bill Shorten, was paid $300,000 per year to write Bill Shorten speeches, and that was for a 2-year period for a total of $600,000. Now, there's no question that speechwriting is very important for all politicians, but it's usually the work of the speechwriter and not the politician. Anthony Albanese's election night speech after Labor won the election in 2022 was actually written by Penny Wong just a couple of hours before he delivered it. And ministers don't have the time to swat the night before a big event and do all the writing, the research, the spell checking and proofing. So that's one reason for why politicians have a speechwriter. And perhaps $300,000 a year for the Prime Minister for speechwriting services just might be acceptable. But even then, I think it's a little bit too much. But Bill Shorten is not the Prime Minister, and we were also told that the Labor government was going to cut this type of excessive spending. And David, we've written speeches for different NGO leaders and community-based organisations, so we do recognise that it's a lot of work, but it's not that much work, is it?
Half of speechwriting is the giving. Robert Menzies was very disappointed when he saw that Churchill read his speeches, whereas Menzies would be given the outline and be able to improvise on the spot to work with the feeling of the crowd. Gough Whitlam was a compelling public speaker. John Howard, I've said this before, John Howard was one of the best public speakers I've ever seen, even if I disagreed with everything he said. Bob Carr was an incredible public speaker. Most politicians are decent. I don't know that Bill Shorten is a particularly electrifying speaker. He's a competent one. But a $300,000 speech, or however many that divides into, premium money speech has to be followed up by premium money delivery, I think. And it's different with the internet too. You do a speech and it goes up online. Whereas, say, Ben Chifley or Robert Menzies or John Gorton, and I'm just picking names at random here, would give the same speech 5 times to different audiences. Bill Shorten can only really give, or Peter Dutton or Anthony Albanese or whomever, can really only give the same speech once, because once it's online, everybody knows what it says and nobody wants to hear rehashed stuff. So in one sense, it makes it easier to be a speechwriter. In one sense, it makes it much more difficult to be a speechwriter. $300,000 to me, well, I wouldn't knock it back, we'll put it that way. But I'd probably be happy with less.
Well, there have been a few great speechwriters in Australian history, and they are generally meant to be not seen or even heard from. It's actually the job of the politician to own the words that are written. But there's been people like Graham Frydenberg for the Labor Party, for many state and federal Labor Party leaders. Don Watson was the main speechwriter for Paul Keating, and I think it's all about choosing the right words for the moment and getting the cadence and the flow all right. There's the Men and Women of Australia speech by Gough Whitlam. There was the Forgotten People speech by Robert Menzies. But I think that the 2 greatest speeches were penned by Don Watson and delivered by Paul Keating. And although there's a bit of a dispute between those two about who actually owns the words, but those 2 speeches are the Redfern speech and the Unknown Soldier speech as well. And here's a segment of the Unknown Soldier speech delivered by Paul Keating in 1993.
We do not know this Australian's name, and we never will. We do not know his rank or his battalion. We do not know where he was born or precisely how and when he died. We do not know where in Australia he had made his home or when he left it for the battlefields of Europe. We do not know his age or his circumstances, whether he was from the city or the bush, what occupation he left to become a soldier, what religion, if he had a religion, if he was married or single. We do not know who loved him or whom he loved. If he had children, we do not know who they are. His family is lost to us as he was lost to them. We will never know who this Australian was. Yet he has always been among those we've honoured. We do know that he was one of the 45,000 Australians who died on the Western Front, and one of the 60,000 Australians who died on foreign soil, one of the 100,000 Australians who have died in wars this century. He is all of them, and he's one of us. It's not too much to hope, therefore, that this unknown Australian soldier might continue to serve his country. He might enshrine a nation's love of peace and remind us that in the sacrifice of the men and women whose names are recorded here, there is faith enough for all of us.
So I think something like that would be worth $300,000 a year, and the Redfern speech as well, quite worth it. And we can see that words are important, words that are very simple and convey simple messages that are quite powerful. And Liberal Party leaders have also had their speechwriters. Alan Jones was a speechwriter to Malcolm Fraser. Christopher Pearson was a speechwriter to John Howard. And John Howard was someone who came up with these angry types of speeches.
It is also about having an uncompromising view about the fundamental right of this country to protect its borders. But we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
So there's good speeches and there's angry speeches, and it's the words that are used in a good speech that can change the course of political history.
Words are powerful. And when you look at the best political speeches, when I look at John Curtin's speech where he said, "We turn to America free of any pang of kinship from Britain," he said that in, 1942. The best speeches actually take the listeners somewhere else. They don't necessarily say what people want to hear. They say what people need to hear. So the Redfern speech made the people who heard it, plus a lot of white Australia, rethink their views, even if those views were positive, but rethink their views on Aboriginal and Indigenous culture and the place of Indigenous culture in Australia. And that's a good thing. The Unknown Soldier made people rethink what war commemoration was. Well, may we say God Save the Queen, which was an impromptu speech, got people thinking about the role of the Governor-General and the role of the Prime Minister. And the best speeches do that. They pull the listener up, make them rethink their worldview. Even if they don't change their mind, they've been taken to that spot where you rethink your view of the world. And as politics has become much more media managed and less risks are taken, we get less extremely fine speeches. It's not that they don't exist. Grace Tame's speech, for example, she's not in politics, but politicians, the Forgotten People speech, in which Robert Menzies gets up and says, "These are the people that I represent, and this is their values, and this is how they think, and this is what they need from government." Suddenly it was one of the factors that made him become credible as a Prime Minister again. He was approximately the same position John Howard was in 1986, 1987, having been rolled, Lazarus with a triple bypass. Howard didn't do it with a speech, although, as I said, having seen him speak, I was deeply impressed with how good he was. And I wished he'd used that power for good. Now, Bill Shorten isn't that calibre of speaking, and that's okay. You don't have to be a brilliant speaker to be a great politician. Thomas Jefferson, who's rather well regarded in American circles, though with caveats now, only gave 2 speeches in his political career. In Australia, Malcolm Fraser wasn't a terribly good speaker. Kevin Rudd was a good speaker, but not as good as, say, a Keating or a Whitlam. Anthony Albanese isn't a terribly great speaker. He's okay. They give good, serviceable workmanlike speeches that get the point across. But it's not just the words of the speechwriter that give the speech impact. It's the cadence, as you said, it's the cadence. It's the love of words, the understanding of which words to emphasize, which words to pull back on, when to pause, when to let it all out in a flurry, when to show emotion, when to be logical. That's what makes great speechwriters, and you can't really quantify it. So, again, you don't need to be a great speaker to be a good Prime Minister or a good Minister or what have you, but paying $300,000 to the speechwriter may be putting a bit much pressure on the speechwriter when the speeches don't go over as well as they were hoping.
Oh, for sure. But within the big picture of spending $300,000 a year is not a massive amount in the context of a $700 billion budget. But it's just the soft grip of this kind of information that's really damaging to a government. And I think that all of this could have so easily have been avoided. And I'm really not sure what the right amount is. And a few history and English majors at university have sent messages to us saying that they'll offer their services for $150,000 a year. And David, maybe you and I could do a job share and we'll do it for $140,000. I think that might be pretty fair.
I'm going to undercut all of those.
That might be fair as well. But the other issue for me was that other Labor MPs just laughed this issue off and made jokes about Bill Shorten still writing his own zingers and that sort of thing. But that's not actually the point. And sure, there needs to be a strong relationship between a minister and a speechwriter, so you just can't get anyone. But you do say to this person, look, sorry, we're not going to pay $300,000 a year for speechwriting, or can you get it down to under $200,000 a year somehow? Because that will make it politically viable and better value for money, because we've got this cost of living crisis going out there and we want to send a good message to the community that we're looking after taxpayer funding. Now, we do small government contracts from time to time, separately, and it's always negotiated down or almost impossible to go over budget, even for small amounts of $5,000 or $10,000. But it seems like in this case, it was a situation where, $300,000, whatever you want, just go for it. And I think it's also the case where the more of this type of information comes out for the Labor government, well, people in the electorate will start thinking, well, hang on, you told us that Labor would be different, but you're just doing the same as the previous mob. And I think that's where the problems end up becoming political problems.
You're right. In a budget of $700 billion, $300,000, it's like taking 30 cents out of your bank account when you've got $1,000 in it. It's not really something that you'd notice, but it's the optics. And this is what the government seems to miss. It's not just what they do, it's what they're seen to be doing. And if they're not seen to be the government that they presented that they would be more or less in the election campaign, regardless the reason, they're going to get hammered. And they need to get a bit of courage, look at what their values are, remember why they went into office, and start acting like that. It might be too late now, but it might not. It's worth trying anyway.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
The game out, we go play. The generation of people that love Tupac. And hey, we banging it in the boondocks. Now put your drink in the air if you ain't scared. Them folks been doing that.
The government has introduced the Nature Positive Bill into Parliament, and that's to support the creation of a new department called Environment Information Australia. And it's also to support other newly created legislation. That's the Nature Positive Environment Protection Australia Act 2024. So everything is now positive. And the term nature positive is a term that's been around for some time within the environmental movement. And the idea is to stop biodiversity loss and restoring nature to pre-2020 levels by 2030. And that's just 6 years away. Environment Information Australia is primarily going to be a reporting agency, and it will improve the availability of accessibility of high quality information about the environment. It will oversee more frequent state of the environment reports. It will establish and maintain environmental economic accounts and track environmental trends and outcomes. But We've actually gone past the point of reports. This is a government that said that it would be reducing the number of new coal mines and gas fields when it was in opposition, and now it's in government, it's opening up more. The renewable energy powerhouse that they talked about in opposition isn't even a work in progress at the moment. So there are new bills and legislation that talk about nature positive, but this to me seems like a little bit like a marketing gimmick that we would have expected from a Scott Morrison government, not one that promised to make improvements to environmental issues.
Having said words are important, here's another example of how they can be used against you, or how the words can turn against you. It's a meaningless phrase. It means nothing. The intentions may be good, but unless it's backed up with good and descriptive phrasing, it's just going to be seen as another joke and a waste of time. And again, the optics. The government really doesn't understand the optics. It's a bit like Morrison, except he thought he understood the optics and thought that he knew what the hive mind was thinking, when he clearly didn't and had no capacity for it. It seems that the current government doesn't understand that you have to have one eye on what are people going to think of this. It seems like it's a really good and worthy policy, let's be fair. But if you can't get it past the Australian people, it'll be just seen as another wasted, trying too hard policy that will be used as evidence against them in a court of disputed returns.
Oh, well, I think the intentions are good, but the big issue is that biodiversity is decreasing at a rapid rate, and a lot more needs to be done to protect the environment. So the policy to reverse this has to be far more ambitious than, well, this is not really a policy to reverse that. This is just a reporting agency, but we're just not getting enough. And it's good to have a central reporting agency that collects information about the environment, but what is it going to do with that? You know, what's the purpose of producing all of these reports? There's nothing that will support this process, and that's the issue. You know, what is the centralised information that Environment Information Australia is going to collate that we don't already know about? The draft legislation doesn't impel the Minister for Environment to do anything with this centralised information, so I'm not sure exactly what the purpose is. And to call your legislation nature positive, that's the type of branding and sloganeering that we used to get from the Morrison government, where everything was based on marketing and spin, but then when you looked a little bit behind the curtain, not much, just a little bit, you just find that there was nothing there. So there just needs to be a lot more action on environmental protection. And I think this nature positive label could just end up being just a fig leaf to cover over Australia's poor environmental record.
Yeah, Australia's got a pretty bad environmental record. You wouldn't think so, given that every time a report comes out, the vested interests come out and say, oh, this is the greenies at work and the greenies control everything and we're not allowed to do anything. But if you drive through the Hunter Valley, or if you drive through Queenstown in Tasmania, or many of the mining areas, you see the terrible degradation to the land. It's not just mining. The large farming corporations care less about tending the land so that you can continue farming for the short-term profit. I'm not talking about small farmers here who know that you've got to look after the land to keep the farm viable and to make it as drought-resistant as possible, etc., etc. I'm talking about the overseas firms who come in and just ravage the land and then sell it off for a tax deduction because it's no good anymore. And there's countless other examples I could give. Australia ranks much further down the list than it should. And instead of being a leader in environmental policy, we're a lagger, especially too when you consider our heroes are people like Crocodile Dundee, the man from Snowy River, Clancy the Overflow, Dad and Dave, people whose livelihood depended on having a good environment.
And we've also been criticised for being a little bit too harsh on the Labor government, and we've just done that on their environmental policies. And some of the criticism has been, well, you're meant to be a podcast that's supposedly focusing on progressive issues, and here you are giving a Labor government a hard time. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not about supporting a government that's supposedly doing its best. I think it's about holding all governments to account, and that was quite easy work when the Coalition was in office, because their corruption, their incompetence, their absolute duplicity and double standards, and sometimes triple standards, were on display every single day of the 9 years that they were in office. And I think generally, and we've said this before, that Labor has been a good, competent government since they've been in office. And I can't see the constant mayhem that we saw for almost 9 years while the coalition was in office, the constant sniping, the ongoing culture wars, the lies and misinformation. And they're trying to do all of that from opposition at the moment with the helping hand from the mainstream media, but at least politics is not as noisy as it used to be. But when you have a government that comes into office and then slowly drops many of the things that they promised to implement, or do things that are diametrically opposite to what they said in opposition, well, that's when you start having problems. It's all of those issues related to AUKUS, whistleblower protections, no increase in job seeker payments, there's more coal mines being approved, more gas fields, nothing at all on media reform or a Royal Commission into media ownership, even though that was promised from opposition, belittling pro-Palestine supporters or people who are horrified about what's going on in Gaza, not standing up to powerful interest groups in business and media. And today we also had the announcement that the National Anti-Corruption Commission is not going to proceed with any prosecutions from the robo-debt scheme run by the coalition government, and that was announced while we were producing this episode, and we'll have more on this in next week's podcast. And these are all important issues for many Labor supporters and progressive people in the community. Not everyone, but many. And these are issues that are not being addressed. And I think that when a Labor government starts doing all the things that we criticise the Liberal government for doing, well, I think that's a problem too. We just want all governments of all persuasions to be better. And if they're not doing what they're meant to be doing, that just needs to be called out at every opportunity.
It's important to hold all governments to account. The anger level is a lot less because it's not everything that they do. I wish we could get better policy on genocide, that you just don't support a genocide. I wish the NACC had more public transparency. I wish Julian Assange could be taken out and David McBride and all the whistleblowers could be seen for what they are, people who actually help transparency rather than criminals. And while this stuff is happening, we have to try and hold the government to account. And that's not just Eddie and I, that's everybody. It doesn't mean that we're going to vote Liberal at the next election necessarily, or National Party, or One Nation, but it does mean that we expect better from everybody. And I think that's important to hold on to, that you can't blindly support one side over the other. You can support one side over the other, that's fine. But if you don't pull out its failings, they then think they can get away with more and more. And suddenly you're back to a Liberal Party-esque government full of incompetence and corruption and abhorrent policy. And so, yeah, it's done through wanting better for the country rather than pushing one side over the other.
So it is a shorter episode of New Politics this week. We've been ravaged by the flu during the week, and it's also a long weekend for the King's birthday as well in the eastern states. Would be better if it was a Republic weekend, but we might end up getting that in about 50 years' time. So enjoy the weekend, and we'll see you next week. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.